everyone. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. I know things might feel a little, well, honestly, pretty awful right now, especially after the recent election. I mean, it's easy to feel like defeated, even hopeless when it seems like everything we've been fighting for is just slipping away.
Yeah, it's definitely a gut punch, and you're not alone in feeling that way, but understanding how exactly these events impact the progressive agenda is so crucial. It's like the first step towards actually fighting back.
Okay, so let's just rip off the Band-Aid and dive right in. We're going to be unhacking the recent U.S. airstrips in Yemen and what they signal for the future. And honestly, the implications are pretty terrifying, especially for anyone who cares about progressive values.
Yeah, you're talking about the most significant military action taken by the new administration, and it's setting a very dangerous precedent. The U.S. launched airstrikes against the Houthis, an armed group who control a large part of Yemen, and they're framing it as a response to Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea.
So like on a surface level, it's about protecting trade routes, right? But digging a little deeper, we see that attacks on Israeli ships are being used as the primary justification.
Exactly, and this is where things get really murky. The Houthis claim that these attacks are in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, a way to pressure Israel. But the administration is using it to escalate tensions with Iran, who they claim are behind the Houthis.
Hold on, so we're essentially jumping into a conflict based on what one side claims is the motivation of another side. That feels incredibly reckless.
It's like a geopolitical game of telephone, where the message gets more and more distorted with every whisper. And let's be clear, the Red Sea is a vital global trade route. Houthi attacks have reportedly reduced traffic through the Suez Canal by 72%. But does that really justify unilateral military action?
Okay, so there are economic concerns, but the U.S. response feels way out of proportion. They're talking about unrelenting lethal force until the Houthis back down. Haven't we heard this before? This kind of rhetoric? It echoes those past interventions that were disastrous for everyone involved except maybe the military contractors.
It's a classic case of mission creep, where a limited objective morphs into an open-ended conflict. And the administration's explicit linking of these strikes to Iran is a huge red flag. It feels like they're deliberately trying to provoke a confrontation, which puts the entire region and, frankly, the world at risk.
This feels like a deliberate step backward, a rejection of diplomacy and global cooperation. And it's happening at a time when we desperately need to be finding common ground on issues like climate change, global poverty, and nuclear proliferation.
Absolutely. The administration's actions are directly undermining the progressive agenda, which prioritizes diplomacy, multilateralism, and respect for human rights. Instead, they're opting for military force, unilateral action, and a blatant disregard for the devastating consequences.
And let's not forget about the human cost. Yemen is already in the grips of a horrifying humanitarian crisis after years of civil war. These airstrikes are only making things worse, further destabilizing the region and causing more suffering. I mean, there were reports of civilian casualties, including children. How can anyone justify that?
It's appalling, and it underscores the utter bankruptcy of this administration's approach. They're exacerbating a humanitarian catastrophe, potentially pushing Yemen further into chaos, all while claiming to be acting in the interests of peace and security.
It's a complete betrayal of progressive values, and it's fueling a sense of helplessness and despair among those of us who believe in a more just and compassionate world.
It's like they're actively working to dismantle everything progressives have been fighting for. And the truly scary part is this isn't just about Yemen. It's like a microcosm of a much larger problem. A deeply flawed and dangerous worldview.
Okay, unpack that for me. How does Yemen fit into this bigger picture?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this administration, while claiming to be America first and supposedly withdrawing from global entanglements, is actually engaging in more aggressive military actions than their predecessors.
Right. It's that whole ending endless wars promise that turned out to be completely empty.
Exactly. Their actions are speaking much louder than their words America first. When you strip away all the rhetoric is about dominance, about forcing their will on the world, regardless of the consequences.
So these strikes in Yemen, are they just a way of flexing their muscles, showing everyone who's boss?
It's certainly a possibility. It's a dangerous and reckless gamble, but it fits with their pattern of behavior. They withdraw from international agreements, alienate allies, and then lash out with military force when they don't get their way.
But at what cost? Yemen is already a humanitarian disaster. Aren't we just adding fuel to the fire?
Exactly, and that's the tragic irony of it all. They claim to be acting in the interests of peace and security, but their actions are creating more chaos and instability. And let's not forget, history has shown us time and again that military interventions rarely achieve their stated goals. Look at Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. These interventions led to prolonged conflicts, massive civilian casualties, and the destabilization of entire regions.
And who ends up paying the price for these disastrous decisions? It's always the innocent civilians, the people who are already struggling to survive.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking pattern, and it's directly at odds with progressive values. The progressive agenda is about building a more just and equitable world, a world where diplomacy prevails over military force, where human rights are respected, and where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Okay, so we've talked about the failures of this America First approach and the dangers of military intervention. But how do we actually shift course? How do we get back on track towards a more progressive future?
It's a monumental challenge, but it's not impossible. The first step is recognizing the problem, calling out the hypocrisy and recklessness of this administration's actions. We need to be vocal, persistent, and unapologetic in our condemnation of their policies.
So we're talking about protesting, contacting our representatives, raising awareness on social media.
Exactly. We need to use every tool at our disposal to push back against this dangerous agenda. And we need to do it collectively. This isn't a fight we can win alone. We need to build a powerful and united movement for change.
So what does that look like in practice? How do we move beyond just criticism and actually start building a more progressive world?
It starts with a fundamental shift in perspective. We need to reject the zero-sum mentality that has dominated foreign policy for far too long. The idea that one nation's gain must come at the expense of another is not only morally bankrupt, but it's also incredibly short-sighted and ultimately self-defeating.
So we need to move away from this us versus them mentality and embrace a more cooperative approach.
Exactly. We need to recognize that we're all interconnected, that our fates are intertwined, and that global problems require global solutions. Instead of building walls, we need to be building bridges. Instead of escalating conflicts, we need to be finding common ground.
But how do we actually achieve that? It feels like we're so far from that kind of world right now.
It's a long and difficult road, but the progressive agenda offers a roadmap. It's a vision rooted in empathy, compassion, and a belief in our shared humanity.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are the core principles of this progressive roadmap, and how can we apply them to the situation in Yemen and beyond?
At the heart of the progressive agenda is a belief in the power of diplomacy and multilateralism. Instead of resorting to military force, we need to prioritize dialogue, negotiation, and cooperation.
So in the case of Yemen, instead of launching airstrikes, the U.S. should be working with other countries to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict.
Exactly. The U.S. could be working with the UN regional powers and even the Houthis themselves to de-escalate the situation, address the underlying causes of the conflict, and provide humanitarian assistance.
And that brings us to another key principle of the progressive agenda: international cooperation.
Right. We need to rebuild the alliances that have been fractured by this administration's reckless policies. We need to re-engage with international institutions and work together to address shared challenges like climate change, global poverty, and pandemics.
So instead of alienating our allies and antagonizing our adversaries, we need to be fostering cooperation and building a more stable and peaceful world order.
Precisely. And that brings us to another core progressive value: human rights. We need to make human rights a central consideration in all our foreign policy decisions. We need to oppose policies that violate human rights, whether it's drone strikes, torture, or support for oppressive regimes.
So in the case of Yemen, the progressive approach would prioritize the well-being of the Yemeni people, not just the strategic interests of the U.S.
Absolutely. We need to recognize that every human life has inherent value and dignity, regardless of nationality, religion, or ethnicity. And we need to act accordingly.
Okay, so we've got diplomacy, multilateralism, international cooperation, and human rights. It's a powerful framework, but it feels very idealistic. How do we actually make it a reality in a world that often seems driven by greed, fear, and violence?
It's a fair question, and it's one that progressives have been grappling with for generations. The answer, I believe, lies in building a movement that is powerful enough to challenge the status quo, to shift the balance of power, and to create a world that reflects our values.
So we're talking about a mass movement, a grassroots uprising that demands change.
Exactly. We need a movement that is diverse, inclusive, and intersectional. A movement that brings together people from all walks of life, united by a shared commitment to justice, equality, and peace.
Okay, so we need to mobilize, organize, and agitate. But what about the specifics? What are some concrete actions we can take to make this progressive vision a reality?
That's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we spent the last two segments outlining some pretty bleak realities, and frankly, it's a lot to process. But I'm also feeling like a glimmer of hope. We've laid out a progressive framework, a path forward now. How do we actually walk that path? What can we as individuals do to turn this vision into a reality?
Yeah, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, especially when we're constantly bombarded with these images of suffering and injustice. But the truth is, we're not powerless. Every action we take, no matter how small, contributes to building a better world.
So where do we even begin? We've talked about the need for like a mass movement, but that feels like such a huge and abstract concept. What are some concrete steps we can take?
Well, it starts with education. We need to constantly be challenging our own assumptions,
Yeah.
critically examining the information that we consume, and seeking out diverse perspectives. Don't just accept the mainstream narrative. Dig deeper, question everything, and educate yourself on the complexities of these issues.
Okay, so read articles, listen to podcasts like this one, have those uncomfortable conversations with family and friends who might not share our views. It's about becoming more informed and articulate advocates for change.
Exactly. And as you learn, amplify the voices of those directly impacted by these policies. In this case, it means listening to and supporting Yemeni activists, journalists, and humanitarian organizations. They're the ones living this reality, and their experiences are so invaluable.
Right, because we can talk all day about the theoretical implications of U.S. foreign policy, but it's the people on the ground who are facing the real consequences. We need to make sure that their voices are heard.
Absolutely. Share their stories, donate to their organizations, advocate for their rights. Use your platform, whether it's social media or conversations with friends, to raise awareness and challenge the status quo.
So we're talking about moving beyond just being informed ourselves. We need to be actively spreading the word, getting others engaged. It feels like a pretty daunting task, but also essential.
It is, and that brings us to another crucial step, engaging with our elected officials. I know it can feel like shouting into the void, but remember, they work for us. We need to hold them accountable for their actions and demand that they represent our values.
So the classic contact your representative strategy, right? Emails, make phone calls, attend town halls. Just make sure that they know we're paying attention.
Precisely. And don't underestimate the power of collective action. Join organizations, participate in protest, organize in your community. When we come together and demand change, those in power are forced to listen.
This is where that mass movement starts to take shape, right? It's not just about individual actions. It's about building a collective force for change.
Exactly. And don't forget about supporting the organizations working on the ground to address the crisis. Donate to humanitarian aid groups, support peace-building initiatives, fund independent journalism. These groups are doing such vital work, and they need our support to continue making a difference.
Okay, so we've got a plan: education, amplifying marginalized voices, engaging with elected officials, and supporting organizations working on the ground. It's multifaceted, but it feels doable. It feels like we can actually make a difference.
We can, and we must. Remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a long and often arduous process, but every action we take, no matter how small, contributes to building a better world. Don't let the scale of the challenge paralyze you. Start where you are, do what you can, and never underestimate the power of collective action.
This has been a heavy conversation, but it's also been incredibly empowering. It's a reminder that even in the face of these immense challenges, we have the power to create a more just and compassionate world. It starts with each of us taking action in our own lives and building a movement that is unstoppable.
I couldn't have said it better myself. The progressive agenda isn't just a set of policies. It's a vision for a better future. It's a future where every human being is valued and respected, where peace is not just an absence of war, but a positive force for good, and where we all have the opportunity to thrive.
And that's a future worth fighting for. So let's get to work. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another critical look at the forces shaping our world and what we can do to create a more progressive future.